2013 marked the first time that women made up 50 of the NASA astronaut candidate class. But looking forward, should NASA try to go even higher? Should the first human Mars mission be all women? Look, it's no secret that we here at Space Time the Question love the idea of cloud cities on Venus. But unless our Occupy Venus Twitter campaign works miracles, humans will probably end up going to Mars first. The question is, which humans? See, several articles in journals or in the press have asked whether it might make sense for a Mars crew to consist mostly or even entirely of women. It's an interesting proposal that warrants discussion, but we need to get some facts straight first. Today, I'm going to review some of the data underlying the various arguments. You guys ready? All right. Let's start with the physiological arguments for all female missions beyond Earth's moon. A lot of us want to become astronauts, but let me tell you, becoming one is not easy. Lots of factors disqualify you from NASA before you even begin, including, currently, height restrictions. Health concerns: you've got to be 4'11" to 6'3". That's it. In all likelihood, scrutiny will be even greater for the first manned trip to Mars, because we can't have these pioneers falling apart 200 million miles from Earth. So physiologically, what's the biggest health concern for astronauts right now? Well, according to a 2014 NASA study that we link in the description, it's not bone loss. Instead, it's an issue where women appear to have a big advantage: vision impairment. Several male astronauts have experienced confirmed vision problems, often accompanied by anatomical changes to the eye, both during and after space flight. All of them were in orbit 6 months or less, which is a lot less time than the 8 months of 0 in each direction that you'd have on a Mars mission. Now countermeasures are being studied, but it's tough, because the exact cause of the phenomenon isn't entirely understood yet. What we do know is that so far no women have experienced lasting vision issues. And since vision is a pretty critical faculty on a Mars mission, and given the uncertainty about underlying causes, this might be a major checkmark in the pro-all-women other physiological concerns column. So, are there physiological areas where women do worse than men? Sure. Let's look at the same NASA study. Women are more prone to space motion sickness when they first hit 0G, but that goes away. Women get more urinary tract infections, but that can be treated with antibiotics. And women faint more easily from standing up too fast once they get back to Earth, which may not be as big a deal in Martian gravity, still unclear. Now, none of these rise to the same mission-critical level as impaired vision. However, women do have another physiological minus that does have to be considered: radiation. Women have about twice the risk of radiation-induced cancer that men do. It's why NASA allows women only half as much lifetime space flight as it allows men. Radiation would be a big issue for a Mars mission. No question. However, given current shielding technology, even men might exceed the allowed radiation safety levels. So while it's a negative for women, radiation risk might be one of those things that you have to solve for everyone in order to send anyone. Anyway, absent to test for or countermeasures for the vision problems, women may have a physiological advantage just because of that. Psychological suitability. What about psychological suitability? Well, the same NASA study reports no sex difference in psychology or behavior during spaceflight. They attribute this to the robust screening and training that NASA astronauts undergo. However, other sources and space programs tend to give women the edge in this category. For example, the British newspaper The Guardian reported Chinese space officials are saying that their female astronaut candidates exhibit better communication skills and adapt better to isolation than the male counterparts. Similar results were found during testing of the Mercury 13. That's a group of women who were put through the same tests as the male Mercury astronauts back in 1960. Incidentally, the story of those women and the subsequent political battle to try to have women admitted to the US Astronaut Corps is fascinating. It's covered in an episode of the PBS series, which I highly recommend. There's a link to the video in the description. Anyway, it looks like women might have a slight psychological edge on longer duration missions. But let's suppose that nothing we've said so far were true. No physiological or psychological edges for women. There's still another argument for preferring women to men on longer space missions, namely that it costs less to send them to other planets. How come? It's about food. Food. While you can recycle air and water, you need to take all the food mass with you on a trip to Mars. And that's true, even if you manage to grow plants. Now it turns out that women need less food to do the same activity as men, so that means less mass to transport, less propellant, and thus lower cost. Now, this argument has been made many times over the years, including by some NASA employees. But it got a lot more attention in late 2014 when writer Kate Green wrote an article to this effect in Slate. Green was one of 6 volunteers, 3 men and 3 women, in the first 4 months study at high seas, a NASA-funded, enclosed, isolated habitat on Mauna Loa in Hawaii that simulates aspects of conditions on a Mars mission. Green noticed that the women in her cohort consumed about half as many calories as the men, despite comparable activity and exercise. This was consistent with what had been seen earlier by current and former NASA analysts that she cites in her article. But what Green doesn't give us is an actual numerical estimate math of the savings, so I did some rough math. Let's consider the long version of a NASA Mars mission. It would be 910 days round trip with over a year on the Martian surface. For whatever reason, the calorie requirements in space and on Earth are basically the same. So taking into account the water you need to rehydrate the food, each person would eat about 1 kilogram of food per day. That's about 1,000 kilos or 1 metric ton per person for the round trip. So how much food mass could you save if you used all women? Well, the crew would probably be 4 people, but let's say 6 just to high, all it. That's 6 metric tons of food. I'm assuming our comparison baseline is 3 men and 3 women, replacing all the men with women. Since my 1 kilo a day is an average of both genders, and since we're only replacing the 3 men with women, that's half the crew, you can knock out about 1/3 of your total food mass. So our savings would be 2 metric tons. So how does that mass savings translate into dollar savings? To ballpark that, you need to work out how much fuel it would cost to get that food from Earth orbit to Mars orbit and back, and then estimate the cost of getting the food plus all that fuel off of Earth's surface to begin with. Now, I worked out that you need about 50 tons of propellant to move those 2 tons of food there, and to bring back the half ton or so you'd need for the return trip. Why so much? Because as you add fuel to move your payload, you then need to add fuel to move that fuel, and so on and so on. This is why space flight costs so much money. Now, my number is conservative. I assume that we wouldn't need any fuel for the descent to Mars, that you'd leave all the food for the return trip in orbit around Mars, and that you'd leave all your waste down on the Martian surface. So what's the dollar savings? At today's launch prices, it'd be between $0.5 billion and $5 savings billion. Our 50 metric tons of food plus food fuel would thus represent around 5 to 7 of the mission mass and 5 to 7 of the launch cost, which might be 0.5 to 1 of the estimated total mission budget. That's not crazy, but it's not entirely negligible either. Now, granted, launch costs are dropping, so these projections could change. But even if SpaceX manages to get those launch costs to 1 ton bottom line of what I've quoted, we're still talking a savings of hundreds of millions of dollars if we sent only women. So I guess my bottom line question to all of you is this. Suppose it turns out that by the time we're ready for the Mars mission we can manage radiation, but cannot manage the vision issues. And suppose that further testing shows that 4 to 6 women locked in a tiny can in a black void for 2 to 3 years would work as a team with lower risk of flipping out as well as or better than a mixed-sex crew would. If all that turns out to be true, and taking into account the cost issues we discussed, should an all-female crew be given preference for the first Mars mission? Because remember, the first Mars mission really needs to succeed. So it seems, to me at least, prudent to eliminate every risk that you know about and are able to manage. But let's see what you guys have to say. Have at it in the comments, and feel free to point out anything that I missed or got wrong. Last week we asked what the most realistic artificial gravity in sci-fi is. You guys had a lot of really great comments. If I don't get to yours individually, don't feel bad. We have limited time. A lot of you brought up sci-fi series that I did not mention in the episode. Let me run through these things in order. Ender's Game. I agree that the novel seems pretty realistic, the movie less so, but since I don't have any numbers, I have no way to confirm this. Interstellar. Guess what? I haven't seen the movie yet, because I have no life. But I looked at the specs, and the ship rotates at 5 to 6 runs. You would definitely notice a Coriolis force. Rendezvous with Rama, which is another novel by Arthur C. Clarke. I agree it has slow ruptures and low Coriolis effects, but it only has 0.7 perez-giz, which might be intentional. I don't know. The Gundam series, yet something else I've never seen. However, Saina Bosir pointed out that its design is based on something called an O'Neill cylinder that you can look up on Wikipedia. And Watcher 1337 supplied numbers for the Gundam ships, which if right, I agree, would produce minimal Coriolis effects. Thumbs up. Finally, some people brought up using an accelerating ship in order to get artificial gravity. So go 9. 8 meters per second acceleration in one direction. This is done apparently in Mass Effect, the Expanse series, and other Niven work called the Mote in God's Eye. The problem is, where do you get the fuel to keep that acceleration going? There's lots of reasons that's not realistic, which is why I didn't bring it up. The remaining comments are about things that happened in the episode itself. Greg Pedden points out that around 3 minutes, 47 seconds, where we had the ball sort of being thrown away in the carousel, it shouldn't go as straight as we had it in the video. It should tilt slightly to the right, because of the already tangential momentum that it had. You're absolutely right. I'm glad you guys picked that up. Divide asked why we didn't bring up gravity gradient effects, namely that in a small ring, this is not as a big a problem in large rings. There would be a gravity differential between what you'd feel at your feet and your head. I didn't bring this up because we don't entirely know the effects of that. There might be fluid redistribution in the body, and you might get more bone leaching in your neck because there's less gravity there compressing your spine. But in the short term, the Coriolis effects are a lot more significant. Fort Storm asks, wouldn't a rotating stations have trouble turning because its angular momentum vector would have trouble being shifted? He's hearkening back to our barrel roll episode there, and the answer is yes. That's why O'Neill cylinder, which I've already referenced in the comments, would have 2 counter-rotating sections so that there would be gravity here and gravity here but no net angular momentum and thus no net gyroscope effects. Excellent question. Thomas Archuleta points out another scene from Babylon 5 that I remember in which Michael Garibaldi drives a motorcycle at a pretty fast clip but doesn't seem to have any weird Coriolis effects. The reason is that if he's driving along the axis of the space station, there would be no Coriolis effects. The Coriolis effects would only be there if you move along the rim, not along the axis. Urgent asks, in a rotating ship like Babylon 5, assuming that you had atmospheric pressure at the rim and that atmospheric pressure dropped with altitude, would there be some point near the center of the rim where the atmosphere got so thin that you'd suffocate and there'd be a suffocation zone? I think that would depend on the specs and how air was being blasted in there. You might be able to have something on the axis to sort of inject more air out and artificially increase the air pressure there. But I don't actually know. I'd be really interested if you worked it out. Finally, John Nielsen, who really likes the show, says he doesn't know what to do with himself.